Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we continue my top 100 board games of all time, covering games number 20 through 11. We're getting dangerously close to the top 10, so these are some really good and exciting games that we'll be talking about today. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 20, which was ranked number 7 last year, so it's a bit of a drop-off considering what part of the list we're on right now. And that game is Agricola, the classic agriculturally themed worker placement game by Uwe Rosenberg. And Agricola here, I love the way the game plays, mechanically speaking, but I enjoy the theme as well. While in real life, I'm not really into the farming lifestyle, I do enjoy role-playing it and kind of putting myself into that atmosphere, into that setting, especially in medieval times as is depicted in this game here. And from a gameplay perspective, this is a very restrictive, stingy Euro game, worker placement game, because although there's lots of different ways of scoring, each of these different categories has a cap. The game caps them and limits how many points you could score. So once you get to a certain amount of the maximum amount of points in one category, you want to do something else. So the game is basically telling you, it's urging you, it's nudging you in that direction to diversify your strategy as much as possible. Some players do not like to be pigeonholed or put into a box or confined in such a way. They prefer a much more sandbox-like experience, like its cousin or younger sister, Caverna. Me, on the other hand, I prefer Agricola. Caverna actually didn't even factor into my top 100. But at the same time, why has this game been penalized? And I must say it's because I only played it one time in all of 2021, and as a matter of fact, it was very early on in 2021, so we're talking about over a year. And although that one time that I played was with the Farmers of the Moor expansion, which adds an additional animal to breed, your horses, and an additional resource for the players to manage, your fuel, which I do find those additions to be neat. I don't think they're essential, and I can do without playing with the Farmers of the Moor expansion. While those aspects of gameplay are neat, it was not enough to help this game stay in the top 10. It had to be bumped down. I didn't play it. It doesn't help the fact that this is a game that I only play with my wife. None of the other people that I game with have enjoyed Agricola or even enjoyed this style of game, so that hurts it. And I also haven't played much with my wife in the last 6 to 10 months because she's been very busy with her own work schedule and other things. So all of these things just to say that Agricola is still a great game. If you do not mind the idea of a strict, stingy worker placement Euro game, you've got to consider it. It's a classic. Try it at least one time. My number 20 board game of all time, Agricola. And now we move on to my number 19. And my number 19 was also on the list last year. It was actually ranked number 14, so it's dropped down a few spots, but still holding steady. And that is Thunderstone Quest, designed by Mike Elliott and published by AEG Games. And Thunderstone Quest is a deck building game with a fantasy theme, but this third iteration of the Thunderstone system has fully fleshed it out to be a dungeon crawl experience. Players are actually traversing through different tiles which represent your dungeon and have different monsters and enemies on these spaces, along with additional threats and or rewards that players can interact with. Players are alternating turn to turn whether they want to go to the village and acquire different weapons, different heroes and allies that can help them. Maybe they're going to the temple to heal, and then deciding whether or not they want to go to the dungeon on a future turn and how deep into the dungeon they'll be able to go, because the dungeon has a certain level of darkness to it. Each room has a certain level of darkness, and to move over from one room to another, you need to have a certain amount of light in your hand. And basically it's a deck building game because your hand is what's going to determine what you can do. It's going to determine how much gold you have accrued in order to purchase different weapons, spells, and heroes at the village. And it's also going to determine how much power you have summoned, whether it be physical combat strength or it be magical combat strength, how much of that you have in order to attack the enemies in the dungeon. Really cool because your deck always stays very manageable, because throughout the game you are gaining heroes, but you're also going through this leveling up process, very much like an RPG, where you're eliminating level 1 cards from your deck or level 0 cards and upgrading to the next highest level, whether that be level 1, 2, or 3. The characters only go up to 3 levels. And that is so cool because you get the same card that does a slightly better thing because it's been leveled up, and you eliminate a card from your deck. So you're, as I said, that your deck stays manageable. It stays very predictable. Lots of cool little neat things going on in this game. You are sustaining wounds when you go into the dungeon, so that's something you have to mitigate by going to the temple and healing, because those wounds are going to hurt you. Not only are they going to add potentially negative cards to your hand, but they're also going to limit your hand size for future turns, and it's going to hinder you and decrease the chances of you having a very optimal turn going forward. Really cool, really neat. I like the theme. I like all the options that are in this game. They are really cool. I like the fantasy theme. I like the dungeon crawl aspect, and I definitely love the deck building incorporated in this game. My number 19 board game of all time, Thunderstone Quest. And now we move on to my number 18. And my number 18 was also on the list last year. It was ranked number 15, so it did not drop too many spots. And that is the Command and Color systems. Any game designed by Richard Borg within the system, whether that be Memoir 44, Battle Cry, Battle Lore, Ancients, or Napoleonics. Currently, Ancients is my favorite because it's my favorite theater of history, antiquity, in particular Roman Greco times. But I've been playing Napoleonics this past year as well, and it's very enjoyable too. Napoleonics, one thing that Napoleonics does that's different and unique from the rest of the system is that it kind of borrows that risk concept, whereas your units grow weaker because they sustain casualties, you roll fewer amount of dice. That's actually something that's unique to Napoleonics. Generally speaking, in all of the other Command and Color system games, no matter how weak your units get, you roll the same amount of dice. I like that. But it's cool and refreshing to have one game within the system that deviates from that and goes back to that classic risk mechanism where you want to keep your units strong because the stronger they are, the more dice they roll. Really cool. I love history. I love the information that's presented in each of the scenario books as they give you a little bit of background for each of the particular real life battles that you are reenacting or recreating. Really neat. My number 18 board game of all time, the Command and Color system. And now we move on to my number 17, another game that's on the list last year. As a matter of fact, most of the games in this chunk of 10 have been on my list. There's only one new game in this entire section of 10, and this is not one of them. This game here was ranked on my list at number 19 last year. So it's actually jumped up a few spots, which just as it's notable that some of these games drop down, I think it's even more notable that games already this high are still bumping up and climbing up a little bit. And that game here is Dominion, the grandfather of all the deck building games. And this game gets lots of hate because it is strictly a deck builder. If there's any deck builder that can be defined as a pure deck building game, it's Dominion. That's all that's going on. You are strictly deck building. It's a static deck builder where all of your cards available in the market do not change. They do not fluctuate. There is variety, but that's all determined at setup when you randomly determine which of the 10 kingdom cards will be available in stacks on your market. I think that this game is such a fun and pure, simple game. I enjoy playing this game without attack cards, and I like playing with the attack cards. Not necessarily because I am against attack in gaming at all. It's not really that. It's just the fact that the attacks in this game add to the length. And one of my favorite parts of Dominion is how quick it plays, how smooth it plays, how efficient it is as a game. I feel like more often than not, we get games played in under half an hour. And that's fun because then we just want to set up a new game and play all over again. I think one thing that helped this game last year is that I finally got the Prosperity expansion to the table. I've played many expansions of Dominions over the years, but I've never played the Prosperity. And I do think it was neat because it adds an additional currency, which makes things more valuable. It adds a bunch of kingdom cards that are more expensive to correspond with that new currency. And it adds an additional victory card for players to purchase, the colony, I believe it is, which is worth even more victory points and has, of course, a higher cost. Lots of cool, really neat things going on in this game. You definitely feel prosperous as you're playing with the Prosperity expansion. My number 17 board game of all time, Dominion. And now we move on to my number 16, yet another game that was on the list last year. This game was ranked number 12 last year. It's only gone down a few spots, so I'm still enjoying this game quite a lot. And that is Shadows over Camelot by Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Mablanc. And this is a cooperative game with a King Arthur theme. Players are representing King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Each player has a unique power that contributes to the overall process and objective of the game. And basically, we are trying to fend off the catapults that are sieging or besieging the castle over at Camelot. But there's a bunch of other quests that we're going on. We're trying to find the sword in the stone. We're trying to find the Holy Grail. We're trying to find Sir Lancelot's armor. We're trying to do all of these different things. We're trying to mitigate between the battle of the Picts and the Saxons. So many different things that are going on. In essence, mechanically speaking, it's very simple. You're simply playing cards and you're trying to get different types of sets, pairs, or threes of a kind. A little bit kind of like poker. But you're doing this very covertly and secretly, because even though you're playing as a team, there is the potential of a hidden player, a hidden traitor. I play that there's a potential, very likely there will be a traitor, but not necessarily, which is even more exciting when you're throwing the blame all around the table and players are not trusting each other. And at the end of the game, you all reveal your loyalty cards and you find out that not a single one of you was a traitor. Like, why did you look so suspicious all game long, right? I enjoy the look of the game. I enjoy just the atmosphere, the interaction between the teammates as we're discussing what we may or may not do, as we're potentially accusing one another of being the traitor. Really cool, really neat. My number 15 or 16 board game of all time, Shadows over Camelot. My number 15 board game of all time was another game that was on the top 10 overall last year. It's bumped down a few spots, and that is Le Havre, designed by Uwe Rosenberg, another Uwe Rosenberg worker placement game, this time with a port theme as opposed to agricultural theme. And this game is really more about managing the resources than it is the worker placement, because you have all of these different resources, and most of the resources, if not all of them, I believe, actually have an upgraded version of themselves. The resources are represented by these squared tiles, and they're double-sided. And on one side, you find the resource in its basic form, and on the reverse side, you'll find its upgraded form. And lots of what's going on throughout the course of the game is players are taking actions in particular buildings. You're acquiring these different building cards, which represent your worker placement spots. Some of them belong to your part of the city. Some of them belong to your opponent's part of the city. Some of them belong to the neutral part of the city. And you're going to these locations and you're triggering actions that allow you, for the most part, to upgrade these resources to a more valuable form, because once they're in a more valuable form, there's more you can do with them. Perhaps you can build more powerful structures if you're talking about wood and bricks, or perhaps you can use them to produce energy. Sometimes energy is a requirement, in particular if you're going to use ships that are going to be used to transport goods in order to gain more victory points. Sometimes your actions are going to be used to just straight up get some money for you, and money is always a good thing, because any money you have in your possession at the end of the game is going to contribute towards your victory point total, as well as the value of all the individual buildings in your possession. Lots of really cool, neat things going on. One thing that I find very interesting about this game is that every round has a collective amount of turns, 7 turns. And no matter how many players are in the game, whether that be 2 or 4 or 5, you're always going to have 7 collective turns, which means one player or multiple players are going to have more actions on a given round than the other player. However, as turn order circulates and goes around the table, each round you're going to alternate and make sure that a different group of players has an advantage as far as turns. So overall, throughout the course of the game, you're going to make sure that everybody has an equal amount of turns, which is a problem when you get to the higher player counts, because the way that the game accommodates for this is by making it longer, arbitrarily adding more rounds depending on the player count. So you probably don't want to play this game at a 4 or 5 player count, because it could get pretty long even when you play the shortened version. However, at a 2 or 3 player count, especially if you play the shorter versions, it's very manageable, and even the longer version of the game is doable. So it's something you want to consider. Very opposite of Agricola, it feels very generous. You feel very wealthy and prosperous and abundant when you are done with your game. My number 15 board game of all time, Le Havre. My number 14 board game of all time was also on the list last year. As a matter of fact, it was ranked number 10, just barely making it into the top 10 last year, and this time a little bit outside of the top 10, and that is Castles of Burgundy, designed by Stefan Feld. And Castles of Burgundy must be Stefan Feld's magnus opus. This is constantly referred to by people as their favorite Stefan Feld game. It's perhaps the highest ranked game on BGG of all of Stefan Feld's games, and it's one of my favorite games of Stefan Feld. No spoilers here. This game here is such a joy to play. It's an evergreen, true classic at this point, over 10 years in the industry, 10 years in publication. And this game here, basically on a player's turn, they're rolling dice, and they're turning in those dice in order to trigger particular actions. And the pip values, the amounts that you find on the dice, will determine what you can do with those particular actions that you choose. And first of all, you have the board, which is divided into different depots, and each of these depots correspond with a one side of the dice. You also have all of these different locations, these different tiles that you're drafting that you're going to place on your estate board. Then later on a future turn, you can turn in another die to place those tiles onto your estate board, your player board, your individual player board, your area that you're trying to grow and expand. And again, your player board is comprised of all of these hexagonal spaces that have different pip values, dice values on them. So when you turn in a die, you can place your hexagonal tile onto one of those spots that matches the die that you turned in. However, you kind of have to build in succession, so you cannot randomly place a hexagonal tile on your board unless it's adjacent to an already previously placed tile. So that's something you want to think about and map out ahead of time as you make your different decisions. And it's truly a point salad because you have all of these different color-coded hexagonal tiles, which correspond with different aspects of your estate. It could be city spaces or farm spaces. It can be river spaces for your ports, or perhaps it could be mine spaces in order to produce additional silver. All of these different spaces that benefit you in different ways and score you victory points in different ways as well. And ultimately, it's a little bit of a race because you're trying to complete entire sections in order to score victory points. And the earlier you complete these sections in the game, the more the game will reward you for in victory points. So if you prolong it for too long, you're not going to capitalize on it and you're not going to score as many victory points. You're also going to be rewarded for being the first player in the game to complete your entire estate within given colors. So if you're the first player to complete all of the yellow spaces on your estate, then you're going to be rewarded with victory points. If you're the first player to complete all of the green spaces on your estate, you'll be awarded a certain amount of victory points, and so on and so forth. There is a cool thing that Stefan Feld has done in other games of his where you are kind of having this game within the game to manipulate turn order. So you're making certain decisions that may not benefit you long term as far as victory points is concerned, but short term, they benefit you with that tactical advantage of being first in the turn order for your next turn. So I kind of like that game within the game of trying to manipulate and manage turn order. I do not like it when turn order is static, when it doesn't change, it doesn't alternate, or when it's simple as just simply passing the turn order marker to the next player in clockwise order. I enjoy when games incorporate turn order into the actual gameplay decisions. Really cool, really neat. My number 15 board game or 14 board game of all time, Castles of Burgundy. And now we move on to my number 13. Yet again, a game that was on the list last year, and yet again, a game that was on my top 10. So lots of games are being bumped down from the top 10. So you must imagine that some games are either climbing, or perhaps there's lots of new games introduced into this year's top 10. My number 13 board game, number 8 last year, Power Grid, designed by Friedemann Friese. And speaking of Magnus Opus, here you got Friedemann Friese's claim to fame, Power Grid, over 20 years later, by far his most successful and well-received game. And Power Grid, one of the things I always appreciate about Power Grid is how many different mechanisms are combined in one place and that actually work. Usually, I'm not a big fan of too many mechanisms being combined, but in this game, it works. You have auction for turn order. You have route network building, very much like Ticket to Ride. You have this manageable supply and demand resource market that players are trying to factor in. But one of the coolest things about this game here is the fact that the end of the game can kind of sneak up on you. It's very open-ended in that regard because players can basically stall the end game or speed it up based on the decisions they make. So you always want to cover your tracks. You always want to be ready, because although you might feel like you're in the lead or you have the advantage throughout the course of the game, if you leave yourself vulnerable at a particular time where you do not have resources to power up your power plants in order to provide power to your cities, if you don't have those resources available to you and another player catches that, they can trigger the end of the game if they're close enough, if they're within reach. They can trigger the game right there. And even if they have fewer power plants than you or less valuable power plants than you, but they have enough resources to power up more cities than you on that turn, then they're going to win the game. So that's something you want to consider. So it keeps you on the edge of your seat. It keeps you on your toes. It keeps you honest. You do not want to fall asleep on your opponents around the table. You always want to be ready for the potential end game, and you want to set yourself up accordingly. Really cool, really neat. My number 13 board game of all time, Power Grid. And now we move on to my number 12, yet again on the list last year, yet again in the top 10. This game actually ranked number 4 for me last year, and I think a lot of it was the novelty of it all. I was really excited about it. That novelty has kind of faded. I played it several more times, but it's still ranked really high, my number 12, and that is Kingsburg. And this is the pioneer, really, of the dice placement genre, where dice are your workers. You're not using meeples, you're using dice, and you roll the dice before you place them, so the numbers you roll are very relevant. They really determine what you can do with your actions. I like the medieval theme in this game. I like the simplicity of the worker placement. It's pretty simple. You have a board, which is a grid depicting a bunch of different characters, your royal officers, your court officers, and you're trying to win their favor by placing dice that correspond to their values onto those spaces, and they reward you with a particular benefit. Usually it's in the form of the 3 main resources in this game, which are wood, gold, and stone, and you're using that wood, gold, and stone to build different structures, different buildings in your section of Kingsburg. There's a city building element to this game. So I enjoy city building and I enjoy worker placement, 2 of my favorite gameplay mechanisms. You combine that and there's a really good chance that I'm going to like it. When you throw in the mix that it's dice placement, so it shuffles things up, it spices things up a little bit, that really adds to my enjoyment of the game. And I also like the medieval fantastical fantasy theme in this game, where at the end of each year, each round, you are in jeopardy. Your section of Kingsburg is in jeopardy because you're going to have a different horde of enemies that are going to attack you. And it could be zombies, or it can be orcs. It could be these different fantastical creatures that are going to hurt you and wreak havoc in your part of the city. So if you do not build your defenses and recruit soldiers with the general, and prepare yourself for that, then you are going to sustain damage. Perhaps buildings are going to be destroyed. Victory points are going to be lost. Lots of things that you want to consider. This second edition here, Kingsburg, comes with the expansions that adds lots of really cool, neat features, additional buildings that you can build in your city, different special powers that make you unique to all the other players around the table, different event cards, lots of really cool things incorporated in that expansion. I just enjoy this game. I enjoy the experience, the feel of it all. My number 12 board game of all time, Kingsburg. And now we move on to my number 11, the last game for this section of the list. And this is the one and only game on this particular set of 10 that is actually a new game. All the previous 9 games have been on the list before. And this game, new to the list and ranking, debuting really high at number 11, and that is Twilight Struggle. And this game here ranked really high on Board Game Geek. I finally gave it a try. This is a 2-player only game by Christian Leonard and Ananda Gupta here. And this is basically recreating the Cold War from 1945 to 1989. Very historically accurate game where you have a bunch of different cards, and your cards are basically determining your actions. And all of the cards correspond to different historical events that actually transpired throughout the years, in particular during the Cold War times. And one player is going to take on the role of the United States, and another player is going to take on the role of the Soviet Union. Very asymmetric game. It feels very radically different from one side versus the other, but I like what's going on. When you're playing your cards during your turn, you can either play your cards for the event that's depicted on the card, but only if that event corresponds to your character's role, whether that's the United States or the Soviet Union. Instead of using it for their events, you can choose to use it as points to determine different particular actions that you can take. And there's so many different actions that you could take. You could do a coup, you could do a straight up attack of a particular nation. And again, this is a very politically oriented type of war, but basically what you're doing is you're winning favor and influence in different particular countries. And if you can have a certain amount of influence throughout the globe, or particularly within a given continent, then you are going to be the winner of the game. Really cool, really neat. I like what's taking place. I like the tactical decision making that you have to make as you play a card for either its event or for a particular type of action. And I like the fact that they incorporate dice rolling. So you use dice kind of as of a modifier. You use your dice combined with any other particular modifiers and compare them to your opponents in many cases. And that the difference will quite often determine how much influence changes hands in a particular nation. Again, if you like history, if you like two-player type war games, this is a game you absolutely have to consider. My number 11 board game of all time, Twilight Struggle. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what you think about this particular set of 10. Which game interests you the most? Perhaps a game you haven't played. Which game are you flabbergasted that I even included so high on my rankings? Also, don't miss us next time, as I will finally be sharing the top 10, the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme, the best games ever made, according to me. Next time, my numbers 10 through 1. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.